Well, good afternoon and welcome back to another live iThemes training event. My name is Nathan Ingram. I'm the host here at iThemes Training, and today we are talking about an issue that lots of WordPress users face, and that is, why don't my notification emails ever get to my inbox? Or why is it that some of my clients are receiving emails from WordPress and some of them aren't? And it might be contact form notifications, it might be WooCommerce order notifications, it might even be password reset emails. Sometimes they go, sometimes they don't, sometimes they end up in spam, sometimes they just never end up anywhere. And why in the world does that happen? And then what can we do about it? So that's what we're talking about today. In this webinar, we've called the case of the disappearing email. Now, when I was putting a title on the webinar, it reminds me of when I was a kid, I used to read Hardy Boys books. Anybody else read those, the Hardy Boys books? And it was always like the case of the green jacket or something like that. Or maybe it was Nancy Drew if you are of the female persuasion. Whatever. Anyhow, that's what we're on today. We're trying to figure out why in the world these emails don't get delivered. So if you are just joining us and go to webinar, the chat room is located at ithemes.com/chat, ithemes.com/chat. That is the best place to get your questions answered as we go, and I'll try to take those in context as we're presenting today. The handout is there as well. So this is what we're working on today. There's about a 5-page handout, and we're going to step through all of these things and see some things in WordPress as well. Okay. So why don't emails from WordPress come to my inbox? Again, very common problem among lots of WordPress users, and it boils down to this ongoing battle between spammers and email providers. It's a daily battle that people who run your inbox, whether it's Google or Microsoft or Yahoo or your own corporate email system or whatever, whoever's managing your inbox is in an ongoing war with spammers to try to keep spam out and good email in. And the spammers are always trying new techniques to get their emails delivered. And it's a really difficult thing for an email provider to tweak their settings just so in order that the real email shows up and the spam gets weeded out and none of the spam hits the inbox, but no legitimate emails get categorized as spam. So it's a really complicated problem. And, there's lots of spam that goes around. I was looking for statistics on spam, and depending on who you talk to, there's different numbers. Let's just say it's a lot. There's a lot of spam being floated across the internet. And dealing with all that stuff is a major headache. Now, how this relates to WordPress is that spammers are typically not sitting behind, Outlook, for example, and sending emails out in mass lists. That's not how it works. Spam emails are often generated by web servers that get compromised. So you may wonder, why is it that a hacker wants to get access to my server? Why do they want to hack WordPress to begin with? And it's not just to deface your website. Oftentimes, hackers do all they can so you don't even know there's been a hack. Because what they're after is really the horsepower of your server. And, the resources that your server has, such as sending emails. So spammers will frequently take advantage of a whole network of compromised websites, WordPress sites included, and other compromised servers to just send out millions and millions and millions of emails every day. So in an effort to combat that kind of spam, you've got on the white-hatted cowboys on the other side, like Gmail and Yahoo and Office 365 and Hotmail and all those people, tightening restrictions on this kind of server-generated email, because that's where a lot of spam comes from. And if it goes out as this server-generated email, the inbox providers, your email providers, automatically become suspicious. So in order for server-generated emails to be delivered to an inbox, it's common for an email provider to require some sort of authentication. So there are a couple of different records that are involved. And we're going to get into this more in just a minute. But you've got, just as was mentioned earlier in the chat room, your SPF records, your DKIM records in particular. Those are the things that sort of essentially sign an email that goes out, a legitimate email. And then when that email is received by an email service provider, they say, oh, it is correctly marked with SPF and DKIM. However, here's the problem. Since server-generated emails often spoof email addresses, they're sending it under a fake name, they don't have this authentication, and for that reason, a lot of it can be eliminated. But WordPress, legitimate WordPress emails are the same kind of email that spammers use. It's just a server-generated email. And so unless you have things set up correctly, those kinds of server-generated emails that WordPress creates, even though they're legitimate, they lack the authentication that a typical email you just send out of your inbox would have. And as a result of that, email providers look at those server-generated, even though legitimate, WordPress emails and say, looks like spam to me. And it might hit the spam folder, or it might not even be delivered at all. More and more email providers, Gmail in particular, are getting to where they don't even let that stuff hit the spam box. It gets filtered out way before it even comes to your inbox at all. So what you might find as a result are those legitimate emails from WordPress, like password resets, contact form notifications, order notifications, never hit the inbox, may not even hit the spam box, might just disappear into the void of the interwebs. So, if you have a WordPress website, or if you are serving clients who have a WordPress website, then you got to figure out how you're going to handle this problem, because it is a problem that needs to be dealt with. So let's go under the hood just a little bit and talk about the why. Getting under the hood to some of the details, and then we'll work towards a solution. So why do WordPress emails get flagged as spam? You got to understand, first of all, how WordPress handles email. This is just a basic explanation. I've got a link here to the codex that talks about this WP mail function. Now, everything in WordPress, like for example, if you set up a notification for your contact form, so if somebody fills out your contact form, it's supposed to send an email to somebody else letting them know, here's the stuff the person provided in the contact form. Or when you get an order, you type in your email address in WooCommerce, and WooCommerce is going to automatically send that order notification to you, and then maybe one to the purchaser. All that uses a built-in function in WordPress called WP Mail. That is the process inside of WordPress that takes whatever information a plugin hands off and puts it all into an email and sends it away. WP Mail is what does that. Now, it's a function called by core WordPress to generate that email whenever it is required in a transaction with the user. Now, there's a term that's used for these kinds of emails, and it's called transactional email. So you may see that term from time to time as you're digging into this issue. A transactional email is one of these automatic server-generated emails that goes out whenever WordPress has to do something. Like, you get a contact form, or you get a WooCommerce, all that. So the user is involved in some sort of transaction, and don't read financial into that. It's any kind of interaction with the web server that requires an email to be sent. Those are called transactional emails. And since those transactional emails oftentimes can lack the credentials that we talked about earlier, they are frequently caught in spam filters. So that's what's going on. That's what's happening under the hood of WordPress to cause these emails to get shredded, essentially, by email providers. Got a couple of questions in the chat. STB would like to know, can you configure WordPress to relay through SMTP? Yeah, that's exactly what we're going to talk about. Girl Who Can't Type is asking, I have a client who doesn't get her WordPress orders, but I do, so I forward them on. Why would that be? Well, it depends on how her email provider is set up. If you're on the same email provider, that's a little curious. It could be that, so for example, if you're using Gmail and you've been, looking at emails from that server for a while, your Gmail has sort of evolved to understand that those for you are legitimate, while it might mark those email as illegitimate for somebody else. Does that make sense? So, yeah, Marcy's saying she's not getting emails from iTheme Security. It's the same thing. Those are transactional emails that, they're automatically generated out of WordPress. So what we're going to talk about today is going to fix all three of those issues. So we've mentioned earlier that there's some sort of an authentication or certification process that has been created in order to make it easier, let's say, for email providers to weed out the spam. Now there's really, there are more than this, but these are the primary two that we are normally concerned with. The first is called DKIM, which stands for Domain Keys Identified Email. Now, DKIM is a protocol that allows an organization to authenticate to email providers that a message is legitimate. So it's basically a stamp. It's like in some ways it actually works a lot like an SSL certificate, where the email is validated back and forth. Yes, it's good. Okay, now we'll send it. So yeah, it's like a seal of approval. It works a lot like an SSL certificate in the way the email sender and the email recipient kind of interact with each other. Anyhow, you don't have to know the details of this. It's an incredibly complicated process. I've given you a link there if you would like to kind of dig into that and see how it works. But basically, from our perspective, DKIM is a text record in a domain's DNS settings. So that's something that you'll set up on the server side, and it will stamp your emails as legitimate. Like, this email actually came from this domain, right? So it eliminates all of that email spoofing business, that this was a legitimate email that was actually sent. It's got the seal of approval. Now, the next kind of certification is what is called SPF, and that is the Sender Policy Framework. It's also a text record. I'm going to show you how this works in just a minute. But it looks at the email server from which this email originated. So the difference between these two, DKIM validates the message itself, while SPF deals with the server. Now, the reason that's important is, and this actually happened early on a lot, spammers would snag somehow a legitimately verified DKIM email. And so it's got the seal of approval. Then what they would do is, without damaging that seal of approval, they would go in and change the contents of the email to something spammy, right? And then they would just send that through their email networks. So it was actually sealed as DKIM and certified DKIM, but it was still a spam email. That's where SPF comes in to say, all right, not only does the email have to be legitimate itself, but the server that sent the email needs to match the one that the email is coming from. So both of those things work together to help to weed out spam. Does that make sense? Any questions about this DKIM and SPF? They're basically text records. They each play a different role in authenticating the email, right? All right, so what does that actually look like on the back end? Well, I'm looking at the cPanel for WPNathan.com, and depending on which version of cPanel you're running, this is the latest, down here under the email section, there is an icon called Authentication. So we're going to click that, and this shows you, right here is the DKIM record, the domain key. It's a text record, and it is very long. It's just basically a long hash string of characters here, and that is the domain key. Underneath it is the SPF. It's a lot shorter, but this is the SPF that validates the domain itself, the sending. So yeah, Stacy's asking about Gmail. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But those are what the records look like. So they're currently enabled. And by the way, when you create it, so for example, if you have a server and you're running WHM and you create a new cPanel account for a user, if you're running the latest version of WHM, one of the little checkbox options will be set up these DKIM and SPF records, right? So make sure you do that. That way they're just automatically set up whenever you create a new account. Make sense? So this is what they look like. It's really simple. They're just text records on the DNS. Okay. Yep, and just like STB is saying in the chat, email providers, like if you're using Gmail or G Suite or Office 365, they're going to give you some special records for DKIM and SPF that you have to put on the domain so that it validates and everything works. You're adding those records on the domain not only to validate to Google or to Microsoft, but you're also, that's what's going to allow email they send on your behalf to be correctly stamped and certified. Does that make sense? Any other questions about this? Marcy's saying, I don't have my own server. Do I do this at my host? Yeah, you want to talk to your web host and make sure that the DKIM and SPF records are set up correctly for your domain. However, we're going to be talking about using a different service to send email in a minute, and that's really what I recommend. So if you don't have access either to the WHM or to, if your email area of your cPanel looks different than this, a lot of web hosts limit the stuff you can see. If you don't have authentication, then that's something your web host is going to have to do this. Carrie is asking, what is WHM? That is the web host manager. It's sort of a, it is in the WHM and cPanel work together. WHM manages multiple cPanels, for example. You'll normally have access to WHM if you have a VPS or a dedicated server. Okay, great questions. Anybody else before we move on? So we've talked a little bit about why this problem happens. We've talked about transactional email, what it is, and then now how to actually certify it with these two things. Now let's actually get into the problem. So we've sort of built the border around this. Now let's actually work our way in and start to solve the problem. The first thing you want to do if your emails aren't being delivered is check to see if you're blacklisted. Because if the IP address belonging to your server has been, if there's a lot of spam complaints that have gone against that IP address, that whole IP could be blacklisted. And if that happens, every single piece of email that comes out of that server's IP address is going to be considered suspect. And you're going to have a big problem. Simply by that IP address being blacklisted on one of the many blacklists that are out there, it's almost certain that any email generated out of that IP address is going to get marked as spam or not delivered at all. Now, here's, we talk a lot about why you want to be, have a good VPS or use third-party email. If you're using a shared host, an El Cheapo, or $5 a month, $10 a month, that El Cheapo hosting, where you are sharing an IP address with potentially thousands of other websites on that same server. If one of those websites gets hacked and starts sending a bunch of email, or if somebody using that domain name does something evil and that domain name gets blacklisted, it's actually the IP address of the server that gets blacklisted. So one bad neighbor on that shared server could cause the IP address for the whole server to get blacklisted. And that means that every single website on that server is going to be blacklisted when they try to send transactional email. Does that make sense? That's one of the real reasons you either don't want to run email through your server at all, or you want to be on a VPS or dedicated server. Because in general, if you're on a VPS or a dedicated server, you have a dedicated IP address. That means it's just for you and your sites. So if you do something dumb, you can get your whole server blacklisted, but you don't have to worry about other people and what they do. Now, there is a tool right here, mxtoolbox.com/blacklists.aspx. You can type in your domain name or server IP here, and it will tell you if you're blacklisted. So we're going to check wpnathan.com. It's thinking. Or is it finished? Let's see. Nope, we're good. So green boxes all the way. So some of these blacklists are not responding, and by the way, all of these are blacklists. And you might be on one or two of these and not on the rest, and that can still affect your email deliverability. Now, by the way, I mentioned, here also, you can also type in your server IP. The way to find that is to open up a terminal window, or if you're on a PC, a command prompt, and just ping your domain name. Type in PING space in your domain name. I can type. And right there, that will show me my IP address for my server, which I can then, at least on the Mac, copy and paste. So it works with a domain name. It also, do it with an IP address, and if you don't know your IP, you can ping it. Oh, we got some more responses this time. So we're all good. And yeah, SPF is correct. Just being on one blacklist is bad. You got to deal with that if it pops up. Okay. So check if you're blacklisted. That is stop number one. It'll take you just a second. It is the simplest, quickest first step to figuring out why your emails are not being delivered. Now, if you're not blacklisted, that means that most likely your emails are not being delivered because they are not properly authenticated. They're missing DKIM or SPF or both. So what do you do about that? You've got to figure out how to authenticate email that your server creates. Now, there's a few different ways to do that, and they all involve a plugin for WordPress. Now, the first plugin is called WP-SMTP. I did not give you a link to that because I do not recommend using it. WP-SMTP for years was the way that people dealt with this problem. And what it will allow you to do is, let's say what a lot of people did was they'd go grab a Gmail address, and then using the settings for the Gmail SMTP server, they just take those settings, plop them into the plugin, and using that login combination of username and password, your WordPress site could send email. Later on, it went into OAuth and authorized that way. And it would basically use Google's Gmail send mail servers to send all the WordPress email. So it was properly stamped. And that actually does work. You can use any SMTP server to do that. Problem is, Gmail was the one that was used so often. Google and other free email providers have disallowed this use of their SMTP servers. So using Gmail to send email, transactional email out of WordPress violates Google's terms of service. And what they'll do if they detect that you're doing that, they'll just shut down your Gmail account. And good luck ever trying to get that one reactivated. There will be no warning, which means the only way you know that your account has been shut down is that all of a sudden email stops being delivered, and that can sometimes be a hard thing to figure out, right? So that's why I didn't even give you a link to this plugin. I don't recommend it. Others do. It's fine. My opinion is don't use this one. If you're looking for reliability of sending email, which is what we're talking about today, this is not the best way to do it. The best way to be reliable with how you send email out of WordPress is using a third-party service like Mailgun or Amazon SES. That way, it lifts the whole responsibility of mail off of your server and onto a third-party service. And these services, that's all they do. You know, they're great at it. This is their thing. They're going to do it. Now, I've given you a couple of options here. And yeah, there are a lot, by the way, there are a lot of options, like Stacy's just mentioned, SendGrid there in the chat. SendGrid is great, but they don't have a free version. Mailgun has a free version, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. There's lots of them out there. Mandrill is one, SendGrid, Postmark, Mailgun. SendGrid, I do not believe, has a free version anymore, unless they've just added it back recently. Let me look and see, because if they did, that's awesome. Okay, all right, you know what? They have changed this recently. So, make a note. SendGrid now does have a free tier. They used to be free for 30 days, then you had to pay money, right? SendGrid is free for 40,000 emails for 30 days, then 100 per day forever. That's great, and I actually like SendGrid better than I do Mailgun. So, I'm going to have to look at this a little closer. That's a recent change for them. Wasn't that way the last time I looked at them, so thanks for mentioning that. Awesome. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about with Mailgun, it's actually the same way with SendGrid or any other transactional email service, so you can take this and use it whatever. These transactional email services typically have a plugin. Mailgun has a plugin, SendGrid has a plugin, Amazon SES has a plugin. And what it's going to do is take over the WP Mail function that we talked about here. So these plugins take over this function, and instead of WP Mail going through your server and sending out email, it actually intercepts that and uses their third-party service to send as well. And again, Mailgun, SendGrid, Amazon SES, these are all really good options. So Mailgun is the one that I currently use. But again, I'm going to look really hard at SendGrid again because they've come back with a free tier, which is fabulous. Let's see where... Okay, there we go. So Mailgun is a rack space service. So it is highly reliable. They have big names that use them. Every email you get through Slack, Shopify, Lyft, all go through Mailgun. The setup of Mailgun involves validating the account with a credit card, and they're going to want a cell number that they can text you a validation code. Then you set up a subdomain on your server. You validate that server with the SPF and Dkim records that they will give you, and then you set up some MX records, and it just works. So there's a little bit of setup involved. Once you go through it once, it's really pretty simple. There are several steps, though. Now, once it's set up, Mailgun is implemented by a plugin right here in WordPress. When it's activated, it's a free plugin in the WordPress plugin directory. Under Settings, you'll find Mailgun, and literally all you do is you drop in this information from your Mailgun account, what your Mailgun domain name is, and the API key they're going to give you. From there, you can just put in, what address do you want your email sent from? What does the name from want to look like? Like Nathan. And then you save it. That's it. And once it's saved, you can send a test email to make sure it works. But once this is installed and active, it takes over your WP Mail function, and it's going to use Mailgun to send email. SendGrid is going to work the same way. Let me install that. So there's an official SendGrid plugin. So let's install that, and we're going to have to deactivate Mailgun because you can only have one of these active at a time. Otherwise, they're going to fight for who gets to own WP Mail. So SendGrid is up, and we go under Settings and go to SendGrid. And there we go. You drop in an API key, and again, you just set up the mail settings of the name that appears as the from, the sending address, the reply to address, and update. And there you go. Now, Ben has a great question in the chat. What is the logging you get from these services? And that's the benefit of using a third-party service as well, because you'll be able to log in, and I should have looked before, but Let me log in and see what I can show you on some reports for myself. But you see every email that went out. You see if it bounced. You see if it was received by the intended recipient, if it was opened. So if it's wonderful to help your client diagnose, why aren't I getting the stupid contact form notifications? Well, guess what? It shows that you opened it. And more than once I've had a client say, oh yeah, that's right, I did get that. So it actually lets you see what's going on with the email that goes out. So you get full logging over all the email that's generated by WordPress. Make sense? Okay. So SendGrid, again, works very much the same way. Amazon SES is another great option. It's using the simple email service from Amazon to send your email. So this is an AWS service, so it's highly reliable, super cheap, and that's pay as you go. So it's very, very inexpensive. We'll look at pricing here in just a minute. Let's activate the Amazon plugin. We need to deactivate SendGrid first, but the settings are just the same. Now this, by the way, is not an official Amazon plugin, but it is by a developers called, wrong link, from Delicious Brains, and those guys are great. They've been around forever. They do some great work. This is going to be a highly reliable plugin. They also have a really cool plugin called WPSES that will offload your media library into an S3 bucket. So they do a lot of work with Amazon Web Services, and it's a good plugin to rely on. But it's basically the same thing. You go here, you fill out the sender email address, name, reply to, then you put in your Amazon access key and secret key. If you're familiar with S3, it's just the same thing. You drop in your access key, your secret key, pick your region, save changes, you're done. So that's the way these work. Now, how do you compare these things? Well, Mailgun is free for 10,000 emails a month. That's why I've been using them, and they're highly reliable. I've been using them now for, gosh, almost 2 to 3 years, I guess. It's been a long time. And I do this as part of my launch process, is setting up a transactional email service, which I will explain in just a minute. But Mailgun gives you 10,000 free per month. If you need to bump up to the base tier, it gets kind of expensive. $79 a month for 100,000 emails, but you do get a dedicated IP, you get great tech support, and so forth along the line. Now, Amazon SES, they have no free tier. However, 1,000 emails is only a dime. So it's 10 cents for 10,000 emails. Now, if we drop SendGrid into the mix here, basically you get 100 a day forever. So that's, what, 3,000 emails a month? Which is, I mean, 100, typical website is never going to go more than 100 a day. High traffic websites, definitely. But so based on how many emails are typically going to be sent, you can make a good selection between these. Or if you just want to put all your clients in Amazon, it's not going to cost you that much. 1,000 emails for 10 cents. Pretty cheap. And yeah, Ben has another option for transactional email in the chat room. There are tons of them out there. I've just given you a few of the ones that have been around a while, and I would consider reliable based on my knowledge. Well, that was interesting. There we go. Okay. So, if you will install one of these transactional email plugins, your emails are going to be delivered. That fixes your problem right away. Now, each of them has a little bit of a setup process to it. You have to validate your domain just so that the email sender, like Mailgun or SendGrid or SES, says, yes, this is actually legitimate. You go through that process of validation, then it just works, right? Let me try to log in to a Mailgun account so you can see what some of the reporting looks like. 1 second while I do that. It's going to take me just a minute here, and then we'll see if I've got some SendGrid accounts as well, so we'll see if I can show you one of those also. Who can I show you? it's actually going to have some stuff. Let's do this one. Okay. So here is, I'm logged in. I am now looking at here. This does not have a lot of activity, as you can see. But here's one that was delivered. You know, they're not getting very many emails at all. Let's see if I can drill into these. Open logs. There we go. All right. So this is where it gets good, right? So this is where it was delivered and accepted. Delivered, even clicked. It tracked the link in there and clicked it, right? So you get a pretty granular details on this. Let me show you SendGrid. The SendGrid reports are a little better, I think. I've got several in this account. Let's see. All right. So here's SendGrid. It's a little better. And we can actually, let's see here, go to activity, and let's just search for everybody within this date range. Yeah, notice here, look, we got one here. This was not delivered. So we got an issue here. And you can pull up and see what that actually was, who it was from, and why it got dropped. The email address bounced. So they got a problem here. We're going to have to deal with that. But that just kind of gives you an idea of some of the ways you can look and start to diagnose some problems. Trish has a question. Is there something that combines transactional emails and your regular site emails? Yeah. So you're gonna, these send as your regular site. So, you know, when an email, let's just say, you set up a contact form notification, and it's something to the user. Hey, thanks for contacting us. One of our people will be back, you know, in 3 days, blah, blah, blah. The email that goes out to the user can be from info@yourdomain.com. And because your domain is validated with one of these transactional email services, it's correctly stamped, it goes through, it's delivered, and so forth. Does that make sense? My own worst enemy, did you show setting up the text records? No, not really, because I just didn't get into that. It's just like you would set up in cPanel. Let's see, DNS, where is it here? Yeah, you would just go and add it as you would any other text record. This doesn't let me add text records for some reason. But you just add it like you would any other text record here. Mike is asking about MailPoet. I've never used them, so I do not have an answer for that question. Trish, if I didn't answer your question, maybe ask it again a different way. I'm not understanding what you're after, but I'll be happy to answer if I can. My own worst enemy is asking, how do you know what to put in the text record? They're going to give that to you. So as part of the setup process of any of these transactional email services, they're going to step you through, hey, you need to create these text records for the DKIM and the SPF. And they're going to give you the information to put in there and set them up. It'll be part of the setup process. Marcy is saying Gmail is working with notifications. The email is not working through Exchange Office 365, which I don't think is through the same host as the website. Office 365 is finicky, I'm going to tell you. Probably you're not authenticated correctly. So you need to, I bet you if you add one of these transactional email services, the problem goes away. Ben is asking, would you test Mailgun on a staging site? You probably could if the staging site was on the same domain. But Mailgun, I mean, when you set it up, it just works. Carrie is asking, are there equivalent zone editor settings for G Suite? No, G Suite does not manage your DNS. So wherever your DNS is managed, whether here in cPanel or whether your domain is managed at your registrar, which is usually a better option, you set up the text records there. Whoever is handling DNS for your domain, that's where you set up the text records. Trish, is there a email server that includes transactional email service as well, Zoho? So, you've got to have something that's going to take over the WP mail function of WordPress. So you have to have a plugin. Now, if you have I don't know what Zoho's policies are on transactional email like this. They may allow you to use their SMTP servers to send transactional email. If they do, then you could use a plugin like WP SMTP that we mentioned earlier, and you just put in the SMTP server that you want to use, put their settings in there, and it'll work. Carrie is saying, I'm using G Suite as your domain email, and you want settings for the zone editor. Yeah, so it just depends on who is handling DNS. Is it your server that's running the DNS, or is it the registrar? It'll be the same place that you put in the DNS settings for G Suite when you set that up. You would just add the other, the DKIM and SPF records that you're provided when you set up a Mailgun or SendGrid or SES account. All right. Any other questions before we move on to some tips, which I think are pretty helpful? All right, so you have a few options here. And if you will set up one of these transactional email services, your delivery problems are going to go away. I've never seen it not work and solve the problem. Okay. I mentioned this earlier, but let's start off with the first bonus tip, which is include the setting up of transactional email in your launch process. So it is in my process now to set up a separate Mailgun account for each client when a site launches. And you can replace Mailgun with the transactional email provider of your choice. Just set it up when you launch the site. You really can't do it before that unless the domain is already on your server and you have control over validation. If the domain has to be transferred, then you'd really have to wait until the domain has, all the dust has settled from that transfer. So what I do is, when I'm launching the website, that client is going to be using my monthly management service, so I'm going to be getting their credit card for them anyway. And so as part of the launch process, I just explained, hey, we're setting up this service called Mailgun. It's going to make sure you get your emails. They just need your credit card for validation, and they need to validate your cell phone. So I get that from the client and set up Mailgun with those two pieces of information. So it's the client's account, and that's part of the process of launching a website. Now, by the way, setting up that separate Mailgun account for each client, you'll get reporting just specific to them. So it makes diagnosing problems a lot easier. Marcy, do I always do this even if there doesn't seem to be a problem? Yes. Every single website I launch gets transactional email. Because if you don't have a problem now, you probably will up the road. Because you're sending unvalidated email out. That's going to be a problem. So I recommend just do it with every website. And if you're using one of these services that's free, up until so many per month or per day, then, it's not going to cost the client anything. You're just making sure their emails get delivered. Make sense? Okay. My second tip is you want to be sure that you reference this whole email delivery issue in your contract. Now, for those of you who were in the proposals and contracts workshop that was a paid event a couple of months ago, you got my contract template where we talked about this. There's a whole section in there on email deliverability. If you don't have that, it's in my course on nathaningram.com on the process course. You can get my whole contract. But you want this in there because here's what could potentially happen. You could have a client that says, I lost out on $1 million bid because your website that you built for me did not send the contact form email to my inbox like I expected it to. And therefore, you're liable, they will claim. Now, there's a legal argument to be made there, but it is a liability potentially for you. So you want to cover your risk there by having a great statement in your contract that basically says this: I can control the sending but not the delivery of an email. Once it leaves the server, it's out of my hands. Now, as a web professional, you ought to be putting some transactional email stuff on your server. However, you can disclaim all of that in your contract, which I do. Because even if I'm using a great transactional email service, once it leaves the server, it's really out of my hands. All I can be responsible for is that, yes, WordPress actually generated that email. And once it leaves my server, I can't promise anything. So you want some sort of a section like this in your contract. You want a local attorney to review that statement, and of course your contract as a whole. You always should have a local attorney review that for idiosyncrasies in the legal world in your area. So does this make sense? How many of you have that now? Do you have an email delivery clause in your contract? If you don't, put it in there. Okay. Yeah, if you don't have it, and several of you don't, make sure, when we finish this webinar today, open up your contract and add it, even if it's just some beginner language like I've suggested. This is a potential, think about this. If your client has an e-commerce site and they get a bunch of orders and they didn't know they got orders because the email didn't come in, you could be liable for that. So make sure you cover yourself. All right. This is a big one. Because there's one thing you can do to break this whole system, even if you set up a transactional email service. You could set up Mailgun, SendGrid, Amazon SES, and still have a problem with deliverability if you do this. Let me show you what it is. Let's say you've got a form, right? We've got our sample form here, and this is Gravity Forms, and I am here in the notifications that go out when that form is submitted. Everybody with me? Very, very frequently, when you're filling out these items, you come down here to the From email, and what do? You go down and you grab the email from the form filler outer and put it right there in the From. If you're doing that, you're doing it wrong. Most people are doing this, by the way. The From cannot be from the form filler outer. Cannot be from the user. Because what you are doing at that point is you are spoofing an email address. Even though you have no ill intent, you are sending a notification from your website that purports itself to be from the user when it's actually from the website. That will almost always get you flagged as spam. How many of you that's a new concept? You are spoofing an email if you're doing this. Okay? So here's what I do. When I'm filling out the Gravity Form notification settings, it's going to be from the first name, last name, and most other forms are similar to this. The From, I always say no reply at my domain. The reply to is where the user's email goes. So what's going to happen is when this notification goes to whoever's going to receive it here, it's going to be sent from an email address on the server that is validated with the transactional email service. You don't, if you're using Mailgun at least, you don't have to validate the email address specifically, but it knows that mail coming from wpnathan.com gets stamped authentic. So I sent a no reply. Now, there's not a no reply address set up at this server, so if somebody replies to it, they get a bounce. Or if you want to set up a no reply inbox, you can. I'm not sure why you would, but you can. And you just make sure you put like a autoresponder on it to let people know I don't monitor this inbox, blah, blah, blah. But this whatever address is here in the from does not have to be real. It just needs to be at the domain that is validated with the transactional email service. Okay? But make sure then the reply to is the user. That way, it ends up in your client's inbox because it's validated. But then when they hit reply, it actually goes back to the user who filled out the form. Make sense? This is super important. And you want to do this whole no reply and then reply to concept in everything in your WordPress site that sends email where you can do this. Any form, any other setting, anything that somebody fills out that's going to send you an email, make sure the email is coming from a no reply or some generic address and not from the user themselves. Because if you do, then you're going to be spoofing an email and it's probably not going to hit your inbox. Okay. Last of all, this is a biggie. It got me about a year ago. Check your third-party email service settings. So if you went and set up Google email for your business or your domain or whatever years ago, like I did, creating a DKIM record and an SPF record was not part of the setup process early on. And so about a year, 18 months ago, I started having this problem where frequently my emails were not being delivered to people I was sending them to. And I'm like, what is going on here? I'm sending it from G Suite. And the problem was now we have to set up DKIM and SPF. And I'd forgotten to do that for my main business domain name. Lucky me. But all I had to do was go in and grab from the Google settings the correct stuff for those records, and everything worked out fine. So whenever you set up third-party email, whether it be G Suite, Office 365, some other service, make sure you're adding the appropriate DKIM and SPF records to your domain as part of the setup process. They will give you that information. But if you've been using one of those services for a long time and you've never gone back and added those records, be sure to go back and add them. You can log into your account. There'll be something in the settings, or you may have to, do a search in their knowledge base or whatever, but you'll be able to find what these settings need to be and where to find them and add those to your DNS to make sure your email is getting delivered. All right. So that's it, folks. That is the case of the disappearing email. We've talked a lot today about why this deliverability problem occurs and some options to deal with it. So as we're wrapping up, any further questions about this whole issue? Yeah, great resource there in the chat. I did not include that in the handout. Probably should have. The good service, it's mail-tester.com. That will check to make sure all your stuff is in line. Mail-tester.com. Any other questions or comments about this? Who is going to, when we finish here, go set up a transactional email service? All right, Stacy's asking, can I use an email plugin for G Suite email setups? I'm not sure what you're asking. Stacy, are you asking about using G Suite as the send mail for WordPress? If that's the case, no, don't do that. It violates their terms of service. If you're asking if there's a plugin that will automatically set up the DNS records for you, no. WordPress is not going to touch your DNS records. Stacy, if you have clients set up on G Suite, then you have to go into each individual client, the domain for that client, and make sure that their DKIM and SPF records are correct. Other questions before we wrap up today? So I am just about to get on a plane and head down to Orlando for WordCamp this weekend. So if you're going to be down there, make sure to say hi. It's going to be a great weekend there in Orlando. Want to let you know, coming up next week, in preparation for the big rollout of Guttenberg in a couple of weeks, we have Joe Casabona back with us for a premium webinar designing themes for Guttenberg. This is free for iThemes Toolkit members. Otherwise, it's $59, which is a great investment for this course. Joe's going to talk about how to design themes so that Guttenberg works really well out of the box. So this is going to be an under-the-hood type webinar. It's going to be a lot of great information. Joe, as always, is a fantastic presenter. And by the way, for those of you who have not heard, Guttenberg is going to be released 1 week from Monday. It is coming quick. It is the Monday of Thanksgiving week. The 19th of November is the current drop date for WordPress 5.0. And I see no reason why that is going to be delayed at all. So if you're not ready for Guttenberg, get ready for Guttenberg. By the way, if you still don't quite know what to do about Guttenberg and you weren't with us on Monday, go to training.ithemes.com, click free webinar library, and listen to the end of the plugin roundup from Monday. And I'd give some tips about dealing with Guttenberg. John's saying you've heard that it's been delayed. I don't think so. Nope, it is being pushed out. It is being pushed out. Yeah, the week of Thanksgiving. So, we have a number of really good free webinars coming up. I'll have the replay of today's webinar up in shortly, and it'll take Vimeo about a half hour to 40 minutes to convert that video. So within an hour, you should be able to rewatch that. It will be here under the free webinar library. Coming up, listen, for those of you who are in business and you have a family, do not miss this webinar. Even if you don't have a family, this is still a lot of great information. Dr. Sherry Walling is going to be back with us talking about simple strategies for business proofing your family. Sherry is awesome. She's a psychologist, and she's going to be talking about how to keep your mental stuff in a row and keep your family sane while you are in business. Do not miss that webinar. It's going to be great. This is also another audience-requested webinar from Michael Moore, who is the support for iThemes Security. We talked about how to interpret those WordPress security logs that iThemes Security tracks. That's coming up on Tuesday, the 20th of November. That's going to be a really, really good webinar as well. So a lot of stuff coming up with iThemes training. Thanks for hanging out with us today. I think we've hit all the questions today, and I appreciate you guys hanging out for the last hour with me. Hopefully you've picked up some good information, and I'll see you next time here on iThemes Training, where we go further together.